Hi there, everyone. It's 4 o'clock in New York, and we have breaking news this afternoon in the form of an announcement from former VP Mike Pence regarding what is arguably the most consequential investigation in the history of DOJ. It is an announcement that is only going to add to the disgraced and newly indicted ex-president's growing pile of legal woes. Former VP Mike Pence says he will not appeal a judge's ruling compelling him to testify before the federal grand jury investigating January 6th. Washington Post notes this, quote, Pence's decision to drop the appeal means he will likely testify under oath about Trump's attempts to pressure him. And he could be a key witness. Trump and his team could still appeal the ruling, but they have lost similar previous cases. A date for Pence's testimony is not settled, though it is likely to be later this month, according to an advisor. Now, the ruling by Judge James Boasberg ordering Pence to testify says that while Pence was excused from providing details regarding his role as president of the Senate on January 6, 2021, he is not excused from testifying about conversations related to alleged illegality on Donald Trump's part. That means that Special Counsel Jack Smith could now gain firsthand knowledge, a firsthand account of the one-on-one conversations that Mike Pence and Donald Trump had that day. Special Counsel Jack Smith, on the verge of access to a central witness in the January 6th insurrection, is where we start today. New York Times reporter Glenn Thrush is back with us. Also joining us, MSNBC legal analyst Paul Butler. He is a former federal prosecutor, now a law professor at Georgetown University. So, Glenn, we've been focused on a couple of other things the last few days, but this is more evidence, I guess, of two things. One, that Jack Smith is a heat-seeking missile pursuing the facts and the investigations under his purview. And two, Trump and Trump's interests do not prevail very often in the court battles that Jack Smith engages them in.
Well, it really is just a sharp reminder a day after people have been criticizing, even people who are critics of former President Trump have been criticizing Alvin Bragg for bringing what some have called a weak indictment. You just don't get any closer to finding out what occurred in the run-up to January 6th than talking to Mr. Trump's vice president, who he was pressuring. I mean, we knew this was coming for a while. After Pence's legal team and political team were spinning the last determination as a legal victory. But it's still really, you just sometimes have to pinch yourself and realize just how remarkable this entire situation is. I mean, the vice president of the United States has just been compelled by a judge to testify in an investigation into the former president of the United States. It's a heck of a sort of a heck of a bookend to what happened yesterday.
And your colleague, Charlie Savage, has an incredibly smart story about how Alvin Bragg's case is a lot stronger than some said critics and pundits thought it might be. So there's lots of analysis out there. Glenn, I want to play for you some of what we know about, not from Jack Smith, but from the congressional investigation into these events. These are some of the most senior aides and advisors to Mike Pence, folks like Mark Short, his former chief of staff, and Greg Jacob, his former counsel, who testified before the congressional probe.
Was it your impression that the vice president had directly conveyed his position on these issues to the president, not just to the world through a dear colleague letter, but directly to President Trump?
Many times.
And had been consistent in conveying his position to the president?
Very consistent.
You've been clear repeatedly with Mr. Meadows about you and the vice president having a different view about his authority on January 6th.
I believe I had.
Did Mr. Meadows ever explicitly or tacitly agree with you or say, yeah, that makes sense, or okay?
I believe that Mark did agree.
During that meeting on the 4th, I think I raised the problem that both of Mr. Eastman's proposals would violate several provisions of the Electoral Count Act. Mr. Eastman acknowledged that that was the case, that even what he viewed as the more politically palatable option would violate several provisions.
It seems, Glenn, that we can get distracted by the what of this, right? Mike Pence, who was the target to be the victim of the violence. Hang Mike Pence was as close to a mission statement as Trump supporters had that day. But he also, I guess on a more significant legal front, he opens the floodgates to Trump's intent, because he was on the receiving end of private conversations that people have testified about, but we haven't heard, at least publicly, from anyone who was on the other end of Trump's calls.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is, you know, when you heard Jacob and Short speak specifically to the repetition of their statements to Meadows, and presumably the vice president's statements that he recounted in his own memoir to the president of the United States, it's just very clear Trump wanted, this was a one-way street. He only wanted one particular answer from the entire team. And you know, it was really interesting. My paper did an interview with Tim Heaphy, who you know was the sort of the head of the investigation of the House committee. And he said the two witnesses that he most wanted to go back and get more information from were Jacob and Short. So it's clear to me that the information that Pence has is of cardinal importance to Jack Smith. And I would just point out the name we keep hearing over and over in all of these conversations is Mark Meadows.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, it's so interesting. We are trying at this very moment, I'll pull the curtain back on some of our work. The story broke about an hour ago. We're so grateful to the two of you for joining us. We are trying to wrangle Tim Heaphy to see if he'll talk to us about those comments. Let me play a little bit more about what he did. And that was Tim Heaphy doing the questioning in those clips I just played. Let me show you a little bit more of what Greg Jacob, that was Pence's former counsel, had to say about what I think, if you had one question for Mike Pence, Paul Butler, it would be, why didn't you get in the car? Here's what Greg Jacobs had to say about that.
The head of his Secret Service detail, Tim, had said, I assure you we're not going to drive out of the building without your permission. And the vice president had said something to the effect of, Tim, I know you, I trust you, but you're not the one behind the wheel. And the vice president did not want to take any chance that the world would see the Vice President of the United States fleeing the United States Capitol. He was determined that we would complete the work that we had set out to do that day, that it was his constitutional duty to see through, and that the rioters who had breached the Capitol would not have the satisfaction of disrupting the proceedings beyond the day on which they were supposed to be completed.
This is one of the biggest, I think, sort of bombshell pieces of testimony. We've heard it in some great investigative journalism, in Glenn's paper and in the Washington Post, that Pence wouldn't get in the car because he didn't trust the person driving the car. He didn't feel like he had any agency over where he would be taken. I traveled with the president for 6 years. I've never heard. I've traveled with the president before and after 9/11 in foreign countries. I've never heard of a principal, a protectee, having a concern like that. Paul Butler, you tell me what you think Jack Smith wants to know from Mike Pence.
I don't think Jack Smith is going to get a day of sleep before he hauls Mike Pence into the grand jury. Nicolle, he's going to want to know more about this conversation on January 5th when Mark Short called the Secret Service to say that he was worried that the president of the United States was going to turn on the vice president of the United States and that there was a security risk. Why did Pence have those concerns? Did he communicate them directly to then President Trump? And how did Trump respond? It's key to both the factual investigation of what happened on January 6th to prevent this kind of breakdown from ever happening again. And it's key for the criminal investigation. And one reason for that, Nicolle, is that there are other people who probably know more. Mark Meadows is exhibit 1 there. But when he gets hauled into the grand jury, he almost certainly will take the 5th because he has criminal exposure. So he probably will never testify. Hence, his testimony is extraordinarily important.
Let me show you one other thing that we know from Glenn's coverage of it, from our analysis of it, from watching the public hearings that the Congressional Committee produced and put on last summer. The committee was able to get around the edges of this phone call between Pence and Trump on the morning of. Trump's uses the P word based on testimony and news accounts. And here's how close the Congressional Committee, without talking to Pence or Trump, who were the two parties on the call, here's how close they got to understanding what went down on that call.
When I entered the office the second time, he was on the telephone with who I later found out to be was the vice president.
Could you hear the vice president or only hear the president's end?
Only hear the president's end. And at some point it started off as a calmer tone and everything and then became heated.
The conversation was pretty heated.
Did you hear any part of the phone call, even if just the end that the president was speaking from?
I did, yes.
All right, and what did you hear?
So as I was dropping off the note, I remember hearing the word wimp. Either he called him a wimp. I don't remember if he said, you are a wimp, you'll be a wimp. Wimp is the word I remember.
It was a different tone than I'd heard him take with the vice president before.
Paul, there's additional testimony. Ivanka's aide testifies to how disturbed she was by the things that her father said. The word wasn't wimp, but the bottom line, and I think to Glenn's earlier point, of the witnesses that really unlocked precisely what Trump's intentions and concrete plans and his role in creating them, crafting them, and putting into motion, it's Mark Meadows and Mike Pence. And today, as we gather here at 411, Mike Pence has no more objections to telling his full and complete story before a grand jury.
He could have appealed, but that would have just delayed the inevitable. The Supreme Court would have shot down his claim of executive privilege. He also claimed speech or debate privilege, and I think that might have interested some of the justices, but ultimately not enough to block his grand jury testimony. So, Nicolle, this was probably as much a political calculation as a legal one. Pence may just want to spill it to get it over with as far in advance of the campaign as possible. And Donald Trump, he might be doing his own political math and doing it differently than Pence. Yesterday, Trump sure didn't look anxious to get to trial in Manhattan anytime quickly. And we should note that Trump could try to intervene to block Pence's testimony before the D.C. grand jury.
Let me bring into the conversation someone Glenn Thresh has already invoked, someone you've already heard from on the tape of some of those interviews I've played already. Former lead investigator for the January 6th Select Committee, Tim Hafey, is our guest. Tim, we played some of your questioning of Greg Jacob and some of the testimony of others about Pence's experience that day. We saw with our own eyes how he and his family were evacuated. And Glenn reported that in an interview with the New York Times, you said that if you had more time with a group of aides, it would be these people around Pence. And I know you and I have talked about how the people you wish that the committee had gained access to include Mark Meadows and Mike Pence. So your first reaction to this news breaking today that Pence will not appeal the federal judge's ruling that he must testify about what may be illegality on Trump's part that day?
Yeah, I think it's really important, Nicolle. We obviously wanted very much to get this direct account of the vice president. We got very close by getting his chief of staff, his chief counsel, his security advisor, General Kellogg, all to share with us what happened with Vice President Pence. But importantly, none of them were able to share with us direct communications between the vice president and the president. You and I, Nicolle, have talked about this at length. Jack Smith is laser focused on President Trump's intent and the vice president's direct conversations with him about his position. I don't have authority to do what you are suggesting publicly I can do and accept these Trump electors in states that the popular vote says that you lost, or send it back to the states. His staff told us repeatedly, he told the president that he did not have that authority. But he's now going to have to testify directly about those communications. That's direct evidence, not circumstantial, and it'll matter for the special counsel's evidentiary showing of the president's intent.
How much does Jack Smith get into the timeline? I mean, what was public facing was Trump attacking Pence on, I believe it was the night of January 2nd or 3rd in Georgia from the stage of the rallies he was doing for the Republican runoff candidates there. We know there were meetings in the Oval Office with Eastman on the 4th and 5th, with Pence's staff there. We know Pence was seeking his own counsel from Judge Ludig and Dan Quayle and others. And then we know about the infamous call. Can you just take me through the turning points in that timeline and tell me where you think Jack Smith drills down?
I think Jack Smith starts with the election or even before the election. Right? This is the Vice President of the United States. So to the extent this multi-part plot to interfere with the joint session began even before the election with planting the seeds of a baseless argument of voter fraud, then Jack Smith's going to want to know what Vice President Pence knew about that. Conversations that he had with the president about the election results, conversations that he had with the president about other parts of the plan, right? Pressure on him was one part of the plan. That'll be the main focus of the questions. But to the extent that the vice president is aware of other parts of the plan, the generation of the fake electors, potential personnel change at the Department of Justice, all of that. And then they had conversations after the fact, right? There's a very frigid relationship between these two men that I think Jared Kushner and Ivanka helped to sort of broker. And there's a meeting between them. I think it's on the 11th or 12th of January. So I think Jack Smith is going to want to know what the president said about what he did or didn't do on January 6th and why, and any sort of the presidential statements that would bear upon intent that have occurred in the days and months since January 6th. All of that. So this is not just, did you make a decision about your authority? Did you convey it to the president? That's the core of it. But I think you can zoom out prior to that and after that. And all of that will be permissible questioning from the special counsel.
Well, the committee drew the timeline out to July and gave us a piece of evidence that was fascinating, an email from Tom Fitton, an outside agitator/activist. You raise an interesting point about Pence as a window or a witness into premeditation way before the election's ever had. Tell me how fertile that ground is and how you would have pursued that if you had Pence in front of you.
Yeah, it's hard to say how fertile it is. You know, there were concerns about possible election fraud in advance. I think that the defense here, the rebuttal narrative will be those were not part of a plot to lay a foundation for challenging the results, but rather genuine concerns about the prospect of fraud. Fraud did not occur. Fraud of any significant degree did not occur. And the president was told that repeatedly. So Jack Smith will want to go back to the pre-existing statements prior to the election, but he'll really focus on conversations that the vice president may have had with the president and other conversations that he had about the election results. He was on the ballot too. He had a very personal interest, obviously, in the results. So he had his own counsel about what happened. So to the extent that the vice president says, I knew that we had lost, and it was explained to me why we lost. You know, we presented evidence, Cole, that they didn't just say there's no fraud. They explained that you lost because you didn't do as well in these sort of outer suburban areas in the key states, in Michigan and in Pennsylvania. You underperformed vis-a-vis 2016. So it wasn't this, it was this, right? The explanation of the loss. So they'll want to develop all of that with Vice President Pence. And if he reached the rational conclusion that the election was not stolen, but was actually lost, and conveyed that to President Trump, that'll be really important evidence underscoring President Trump's intent to disrupt the joint session.
John Eastman seems to be a dividing line between Pence and Trump. And it's unclear. I mean, it seems that even Trump was aware that Eastman's plot was illegal and unconstitutional. I guess we don't know that for sure, but there's evidence that was developed that suggests that. We know, though, through Pence's aides, that Pence concluded that the Eastman plot to steal the election was illegal. Can I play some of their public statements and ask you about the line of questioning about what was going on behind the scenes?
And I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much. I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so. Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. And we're going to have to fight much harder. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country.
And all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not.
So I believe the committee presented evidence publicly that both men knew that the Eastman plot was illegal before those public statements were made. How damaging is Pence to both of their legal futures?
Pence is really damaging, Nicolle, because before any of those clips that you just played, he told the president, I've looked at this, I've consulted with experts, I don't have the authority, and I will not and cannot do what you are suggesting I do by accepting these electors or sending it back to the states. Nonetheless, the public pressure, right, the last prong of the multi-part prong to prevent the transfer of power and disrupt the joint session is the activation of the mob, right? The president is getting people there at the ellipse exercised by giving them this hope somehow that the vice president is going to do something that he has repeatedly told the president directly, and that's what the vice president presumably will testify, that he could not do. Nonetheless, the president continues that rhetoric saying, Mike Pence does this, then we'll all be very happy, right? They're going to ask Mike Pence about a meeting in the Oval Office between John Eastman, President Trump, and Vice President Pence. Pat Cipollone testified that he was coming to that meeting and he was told not to come. And he wouldn't share with us why, because he invoked executive privilege. But this is a really important moment because he was really awkwardly sort of squirming when we asked him, why didn't you attend the meeting? He didn't attend the meeting because he didn't agree, right? He disagreed. He was the truth teller in the room who was going to say, nah, that doesn't work, Mr. Eastman. That doesn't work, Mr. President. The vice president does not have that authority. So that meeting, right, and I think that was on the 3rd of January, several days, obviously, before the incendiary speech on the ellipse, they're going to ask Mike Pence to describe that conversation, and Mike Pence should have to describe directly what he said, what Eastman said, and what the president said. And that's some of the first evidence of the president's own participation in conversations about that bogus Eastman theory.
And then somewhere between that meeting that Trump participates in, that Pence is in the room for, that he will certainly be asked about, his staff develops evidence of the security situation and the propensity for violence among the Trump supporters. And his chief of staff calls in the Secret Service, and they know exactly what's going to happen. The committee also developed evidence that Robert O'Brien, the national security advisor, knew by the 5th that there would be, quote, violence on the Hill on the 6th. How much is Pence a fact witness on the knowledge ahead of time of the violence directed at him and directed at the men and women, including law enforcement at the U.S. Capitol?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because the special counsel, in figuring out what the president intended, is going to want to develop evidence about how much advance warning about the prospect of violence there was. You're right. We developed testimony from Mark Short that he alerted the Secret Service of his concerns about the vice president's safety. I think that was on the day before January 6th, on January 5th. If Vice President Pence himself had similar concerns, was presented with intelligence about the prospect of violence, the same intelligence that Robert O'Brien saw, that Mark Short saw, that the Secret Service and the FBI gathered, then that's hard for the president to argue that when he made that incendiary speech on the ellipse, he had no idea that this could become a violent attack on the Capitol. That advance warnings of violence, again, really inform his words and his conduct. You have to see those words and that conduct in the context of mindful awareness of the prospect of violence. And Pence, if he has that information, that would be directly relevant.
So I'm dying to ask you about the car and the underground parking lot where he stays and why he doesn't get in the car and what he knows and the evidence you've developed from Mr. Kellogg and others I have to sneak in a break, but I want to pursue that on the other side if everyone can stick around with us a little bit longer. There are other things we're gonna get to. It has been described as the most important election of the year. Democrats won huge. We'll talk about the Wisconsin Supreme Court race and the major consequences for our democracy and for abortion health care in America. Later in the program, on the same night, Fox News host rose up to defend Donald J. Trump in these 34 criminal charges that were filed against him. Their employer has offered them up as primetime spots as witnesses in the upcoming billion-dollar defamation lawsuit against them. They'll appear live in a Delaware courtroom. All those stories and more when Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere today.
Hi, I'm Tom Llamas, and for me, the news is so much more than a headline. It informs, it inspires, and it still matters. To cover it, you have to be in it. We'll take you to the front lines of the story, where it's actually happening, with NBC News journalists on the ground from all over the world. We cover what you need to know and bring your newsfeed to life. In primetime and streaming live, it's your news playlist. Join me for Top Story, weeknights at 7 Eastern on NBC News Now.
Let me be clear. I'm going to fight the Biden DOJ's subpoena to appear before the grand jury because I think it's unprecedented and it's unconstitutional.
Until it's not. We are joined by Glenn Thrush from the New York Times, Paul Butler, and Tim Hafey because this news broke just about an hour ago. Quote, Pence won't appeal ruling that compels his grand jury testimony on January 6th. Tim, I want to ask you, do you know the answer to this? If you simply have Pence before a grand jury or a jury ultimately, why didn't he get in the car? What did he know about where they wanted to take him and why they didn't want him at the Capitol?
Oh, well, I can tell you what Mark Short told us. Mark was with him all day, and he told us that Mike Pence didn't want the world to see the image of the vice president fleeing the Capitol in the midst of a violent attack. That to him, he was mindful of the oppression that would send. That democracy was fragile and could be interrupted, and he did not want that image. So he literally sat with his legs outside of the vehicle. So he's sort of half in and half out of the car. There's the photograph right there, exactly. And Mark Short testified that was purposeful, that he knew that the Secret Service agents who he trusted very much could, for his safety, whisk him away. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of Secret Service text messages, which we found, Teams messages that suggested their intention was to do just that, was to remove him from the building. And he refused to get fully in the car to prevent that from happening. Obviously something that the special counsel will want to develop, right? Why didn't you get in the car? What was going on during the riot? Who'd you talk to? What information did you receive? A real-time, minute-to-minute account will be important for the special counsel to develop.
What else? You think like Jack Smith, you pursued the same body of evidence that Jack Smith is now up to his elbows with. Paul Butler said he probably won't sleep between this announcement today and the opportunity to actually interview Mr. Pence. What other questions do you think he's developing for the former vice president?
Yeah, look, I think it goes back to not just what happened, but the predicates for what happened. Hard to understate the closeness between Mike Pence and the president through the 4 years. Hard to understate the synchronicity of them during the campaign. So all of the predicate issues, the election, stop the steal narrative, he is going to want to develop Mike Pence's awareness of all of that. Think of another question I would want to ask him about, Nicolle, is what we call the big ripoff or the big fraud. So immediately after the campaign ends and the networks declare President-elect Biden the victor, they keep raising money. They just shift it from the Trump for President campaign to the Save America PAC as the recipient. And they raised almost $250 million from some of the very same people that had given money during the campaign between when the election happens and Inauguration Day. So Mike Pence is There's some evidence that Mike Pence was not participating in that or didn't think that was a good idea. So his knowledge of the fundraising strategy, his efforts to distance himself from it. He also, we don't believe, ever used the words "stop the steal" in any public statements, which suggest a slightly different understanding of and approach to the issue. So all the important contextual things beyond the violence and the attack, but the big fraud, the stop the steal, all of that has the potential for Mike Pence to be a really important witness for Jack Smith.
I mean, Glenn, I want to bring you back in on this. I think what Tim just said very diplomatically and respectfully is Mike Pence didn't think the election had been stolen. I mean, Mike Pence is an important witness in terms of, were you on Earth 1 or Earth 2? Earth 1, where Joe Biden was the legitimate, lawful president-elect, or Earth 2, where Donald Trump was going to use the military to steal voting machines, Rudy Giuliani to explain it to the country, and Ron Johnson and other yahoos in the Congress to rig the certification.
Of course, Mike Pence didn't think the election was stolen because the election wasn't stolen. And, I think, I have to hearken back to the prehistoric Mike Pence when his wife warned him not to get involved with Donald Trump, and he chose to do so anyway. So to some extent, when every time that I look at those images, I think, he may want to reconsider the advice that she gave him at that point in time. But look, I think what Tim said is really, I think, fundamental and in keeping with what I've heard from my sources. A part of this is about Pence establishing Pat Cipollone, establishing very early on people who knew what was going on. Let the president, Bill Barr, let the president know that there was no merit to this argument, that the election was stolen, that they had done, in Barr's case, that he'd done an investigation internally and discovered that there wasn't this Venezuelan plot with the voting machines, for instance. So part of this is about Pence being a person who can establish in a very real way that the president had access to information that should have led him to conclude that he was pursuing a path that was not only unlawful, but just completely wrong. So, I mean, Pence serves a lot of different roles. And I can tell you just in general, having been around Pence's folks for years and years and years, they, throughout the course of his presidency, were questioning things that Trump was doing. I took a spin through the former vice president's memoirs, and things are obviously being put very diplomatically, but it was very, very clear in real time that Pence's staff, starting from the very earliest days of the administration, were not on board with a lot of what Trump was up to.
Which begs a whole nother host of questions that we need a whole nother 35 minutes to get through. Glenn Thrush and Paul Butler and Tim Hafey, who all jumped when this news broke to help us understand it and talk it through. Thank you so much for starting us off today. We're really grateful. Up next for us, you may never have heard of her before, but a win last night for a Wisconsin Supreme Court seat could have huge consequences for the entire nation. We'll tell you about that contest and what it means for abortion rights and democracy next. Yesterday was a Tuesday, and you'd be forgiven for not realizing, with all that was going on in a small courtroom in New York City, that it was also Election Day. Arguably, the biggest contest in 2023 took place in Wisconsin yesterday. A race for a seat on that state's Supreme Court, resulting in a major win for progressives, a 10-point victory, giving liberals their first majority on the state's highest court in 15 years. And it could send a signal to red states all across America. Janet Protasewicz, a judge on the Milwaukee County Circuit Court, defeated conservative Dan Kelly, a former state Supreme Court justice. With her win, the Supreme Court in Wisconsin could reverse that state's abortion ban, which was one of the central pillars of her candidacy. Here she was last night addressing that.
Wisconsin voters have made their voices heard. Yes. They've chosen to reject partisan extremism in this state. Too many have tried to overturn the will of the people. Today's results show that Wisconsinites believe in democracy and the democratic process.
Joining our coverage, Cecile Richards, former president of Planned Parenthood, now co-chair of American Bridge, and former Maryland Congresswoman, now an MSNBC contributor, Donna Edwards, is also here. The three of us don't get to gather for many conversations about abortion health care with hugely positive, reassuring, good news about the country, about the future of abortion rights, about the power of the issue. But today we get to do just that. I start with you, Cecile.
Look, there's no way to overstate what a big night it was. As you said, this is the most important race, perhaps, of this year, certainly in 2023 so far. And the turnout was amazing. It reminded me actually kind of the Kansas referendum when it just broke all kinds of records. We had students standing in line to vote outside of the University of Madison and Eau Claire. We beat turnout in 2020 during a presidential primary. I mean, people wanted to go vote. And it was clear that this election was about democracy. And it was about the fact that an 1849 abortion ban is in effect right now in the state of Wisconsin, and that this was the race that could make the difference. So it's a very good day to celebrate, and I think it's a good day to acknowledge how both the Republican extremism turns off their voters, but it also energizes people who otherwise wouldn't go to the polls.
It's such an important point, Cecile, and I want to read some more coverage about the 1840s law, because we always try to bring this back to what's happening to women in these states right now. But I don't want to skim over. I mean, we do, and that's on me. I do focus a lot on how the Republican Party has been taken over by such extremists, even by the Republican Party's former standards. And I don't spend enough attention on what that means, not just for the Democratic Party, but the largely sort of silent middle that we don't know a ton about, except on nights like last night, election nights. It is not just animating and unifying. It is changing behaviors. It is changing voting patterns. It is perhaps the biggest tectonic plate shift in recent times. Just talk about the information we're still gathering about how powerful this issue is as something that makes people go vote.
Well, we obviously saw, this is, in a way, it's just more of the same of what we saw last year in the midterm elections, where record-breaking turnout, getting folks, always talk about it's hard to get young people to vote. Well, young people are voting now all over the place because they know what's at stake. It's their future. And I think that, we saw certainly in the midterms that a lot of people who were non-voters, because so many people don't turn out in these special elections and a Supreme Court race. That's like really hard to get people to turn out. And yet folks obviously were highly, highly motivated. I think it's also, and it's a sign again, it's not just motivating to the Democratic base. This is engaging independent voters. There is no more swing state than the state of Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. And the fact that this judge won by more than 10 points is, I think, just very telling about where the middle of the country is.
And Donna, she ran on abortion rights. This is from Politico's reporting on this race. Wisconsin has an 1840s law on the books that bans abortion in nearly all instances in the state. State Attorney General Josh Cowell, a Democrat, has brought a lawsuit challenging that law in state court that is widely expected to eventually land in front of the state Supreme Court. But in the interim, abortion providers have stopped performing the procedure in the state. On the trail, Protasewicz has repeatedly said, quote, "My personal value is that a woman has a right to choose," while stressing that she is merely speaking about her values and not prejudging any particular court case. Talk about what you see in last night's big, resounding win for her.
Well, first of all, I think the real story here is one that Cecile talked about, and it is about young people. That young people on every college campus all across the state turned out to vote in record numbers, actually a higher turnout for them than in 2022, which was already a high turnout. More votes cast for, and I'm not going to botch your name, I'll just say Judge Janet, than were cast for Tony Evers for governor and Mandela Barnes for Senate. So
wow.
young people really felt the power of their vote, and they voted. She campaigned both on abortion rights and on democracy. And I think the combination of these issues not only motivates young people, but motivates all those independent and suburban women voters who were completely turned off by the Republican, formally endorsed Trump Republican who was running in the race. And voters actually saw through that. And so I can see that carrying through in the 2024 election cycle. It is a very powerful and motivating electorate out there.
Yeah, I mean, the Republicans have gotten themselves on the wrong side of a majority of voters, including many of their own, on abortion, but also on democracy, which we now know from elections and polls is something that is tangible to people. They understand it. Let me read from NBC's reporting on that. The state Supreme Court is likely to hear various challenges to existing election laws, as well as cases that might relate to recounts, absentee ballots, and other facets of election administration that could have material impacts on the outcomes of close elections in the perpetual battleground state, including the 2024 presidential election. For example, in a 4-3 decision last year, the state Supreme Court deemed all ballot drop boxes outside of election clerks' offices illegal, a setback for Democrats who had advocated to preserve one of the more lenient rules about the boxes that arose during the coronavirus pandemic. 2 years earlier, the court, in another 4-3 vote, narrowly upheld the 2020 election results in the state. We tried on it to shine a light on this show with Mark Elias and with folks like both of you on the war on democracy that Republicans are waging in the states, red states and blue states and swing states, every day. This race last night also brought that in focus about how that is playing and how voters are acting and responding at the polls.
Well, I mean, I think that you can see that. And again, this is very motivating for young people to vote. Keep in mind that in Wisconsin, there's same-day voter registration. And so the power of turning out voters on Election Day, where they were not able to vote in early elections because these voting places were not allowed on campus during early vote. And so I think voters are really feeling the pull of democracy. They feel the responsibility to protect democracy. And these continue to be motivating issues for voters. And again, the totally untold story is the power that young people feel in protecting our democracy and protecting their rights. And these issues are going to come up before the Supreme Court in Wisconsin in the short order, both redistricting maps that will come up before the court and abortion rights in front of the court. So this was a monumental election. And needless to say, of course, Judge Janet was on stage celebrating with the 3 other women who are on the Supreme Court who labored in the minority and now will help form a majority.
It was an incredible visual. I want to ask both of you to stick around because we have to talk about the other guy. We're going to cover, when we come back, how the defeated conservative acted last night in the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. I'm not even sure we can call it a concession, but we'll tell you about it. Don't go anywhere.
Hey everyone, it's Tremaine Lee, MSNBC correspondent and host of the podcast Into America. A train derailment and chemical spill in East Palestine, Ohio, caused panic and anger among residents and triggered a big response from the EPA. But for people who live in so-called sacrifice zones, especially in Black communities, environmental issues like this are a way of life.
So when you live in a sacrifice zone, you're basically being poisoned every day. So it becomes an intergenerational cycle of poison and poor public health.
Listen now and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
I do not have a worthy opponent to which I can concede. This was the most deeply deceitful, dishonorable, despicable campaign I have ever seen run for the courts. It was truly beneath contempt. My opponent is a serial liar. This is the future that we have to look forward to in Wisconsin.
That was sore loserman. I'm sorry. Dan Kelly, the conservative candidate, after losing decisively, fair and square, last night for a seat on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Cecile and Donna, I mean, all kidding aside, one of the things, all of the things that Republicans are parroting out in the states of refusing to concede, we can talk about whether they represent good or bad things in human character, but they're horrific electorally. I mean, the voters are not into them at all. And if you reach a tipping point where, I mean, Wisconsin's maps are incredibly lopsided for a state that you accurately described as both of you did, as one of the swingiest of all. The Republican supermajorities in the legislative chambers have the congressional delegation at a 6-2 split for a really 50-50 state. I mean, what is possible now in terms of writing these really wonky, non-representative maps?
Well, there's enormous potential, obviously, for getting fair maps. And I think I've spent a lot of time in Wisconsin. Folks in Wisconsin believe in democracy. They believe in fair play. And this guy just obviously represents something so completely different. One thing that hasn't been mentioned in this conversation is that, of course, there were allegations and pretty credible linkages between Mr. Kelly and the efforts to have a fake group of electors during the last election. So freedom and belief in our democracy was very much on the ballot. The positions, as you were illustrating earlier, Nicolle, about the efforts to deny people the right to vote, ending boxes for balloting. This is really, I think, against the grain of where Wisconsin voters are. These are not partisan issues. I think, Wisconsin people believe in fairness, and Dan Kelly did not represent that at all.
Yeah, I mean, Donna, the threats to democracy are chilling. The autocratic conduct of Republican candidates is also a giant electoral zero. It's a loser. It looks weak. It looks un-American. It looks like a bad practice. It's not how anybody's raising their kids. If you lose, you lose, and you walk across the field and you shake the hands of the members of the other team. That is not embodied by today's Republicans.
Well, it's not embodied, embraced by voters, that kind of behavior. And I think, what you see is that Trumpism has seeped into the core of the Republican Party. Dan Kelly was endorsed by Donald Trump in 2020, but was not in this election. And yet that Trumpism goes all the way through, from the election denying to the supporting the fake electors, to the way that he ended this campaign. And by the way, he trashed one of his Republican opponents, a woman, in that same race in the primary, and so badly that it turned off so many of those independent and moderate voters who were turned off by Dan Kelly. And so this is a dead loser for Republicans, but they haven't seemed to realize that it doesn't translate into votes in a general election.
It is amazing to watch a political party sort of rot and implode from the inside out. Just amazing. I'm so grateful to both of you for joining us to talk about this race last night. Thank you so much to Cecile Richards and Donna Edwards. Coming up next for us, a major development in that Dominion defamation case. A judge says he's willing to force Rupert Murdoch to testify live in that trial. The next hour of Deadline White House starts after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
Trump was criminally charged because he is planning to challenge Joe Biden in the upcoming presidential election. It's really that simple. If Donald Trump had retired in 2020, would he have been arraigned today? Of course not. This is the boldest election interference ever attempted in this country's history.
Hi, everyone. It'd be funny if it wasn't so dangerous. It's 5 o'clock in New York. That happened hours before that happened. Before Tucker Carlson made those wild and false claims at the top of his show last night about the next election, defending the now criminally indicted ex-president, Tucker Carlson was offered up. He was among those listed as witnesses his network intends to make available in the trial that is examining Fox's own role in the former president's attempts to interfere in the previous election. Following last week's ruling by the judge that the Dominion lawsuit against Fox News will go forward, it will go to trial, the network filed its list of witnesses that it will make available in person. Among that list, lots of names you'll recognize: Fox anchors Maria Bartiromo, Tucker Carlson, Lou Dobbs, Sean Hannity, Jeanine Pirro, Brett Baier, Dana Perino, and Fox News CEO Suzanne Scott. Reuters reports this, quote, "The list promises a high-wattage parade of witnesses at the jury trial scheduled to start on April 17th and expected to last about 4 weeks. But conspicuously absent from Fox's list, that company's chairman, Rupert Murdoch, and his son, Lachlan. Well, today, Dominion sent a letter to the judge asking the judge to compel live testimony from the Murdochs, as well as from Fox board member Paul Ryan and another Fox executive. That fight escalated in a hearing this afternoon where Delaware Superior Court Judge Eric Davis deemed that Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch's testimony is, quote, very relevant, and that lawyers for Dominion should issue trial subpoenas to force their testimony. He said this, quote, "I would not quash it, and I would compel them to come. It would be my discretion that they come." This ongoing fight over witnesses with less than 2 weeks ahead of Dominion's defamation lawsuit against Fox News goes to trial is where we begin the hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. New York Times political reporter and MSNBC contributor Jeremy Peters is here. Also joining us, legal analyst Katie Phang, host of MSNBC's The Katie Phang Show. And Tim Miller's back. He's a writer at large for The Bulwark, also an MSNBC contributor. Jeremy, I start with you. I mean, it sounds like Dominion wants the Murdochs to testify. The judge says he will support and back a subpoena for them if that's the path they choose. It sounds like the Murdochs will testify.
They absolutely will. And I think inside Fox, it was always considered a bit of a legal long shot to keep them off the witness stand. Delaware law compels corporate officers like the Murdochs to testify in these trials. And the judge himself at a hearing last week indicated that he was losing patience with a lot of Fox's arguments and objections. And at one point said, look, I've just read news reports about Rupert Murdoch getting engaged and talking about how excited he was to be traveling around to all his houses everywhere around the world. I think it's possible he can get on a plane and come down to Wilmington, Delaware to testify for an afternoon. And in the end, that's what you heard from the judge today. The Murdochs will testify in the trial. We don't know exactly when, but that's really significant because the Murdochs have a history of their personal appearances making a big difference in these highly contentious types of cases. You will remember back about a decade ago during the phone hacking scandal in Britain, Rupert Murdoch testified before Parliament. That was when he had a pie thrown in his face, and his wife at the time, Wendy Dang, interrupted tried to intercept the pie from the attacker, and it was a really bad look. I think inside Fox, people around the Murdochs were hoping to avoid testimony for reasons similar to that. They didn't want another type of image problem dogging this trial. And, he's in his 90s. He's still, by, most accounts I hear, very sharp. But anybody in their 90s is not going to be physically all there. And it does really, raise questions about what his presence before the jury signals to them. And if that is a help or a hindrance to Fox's overall case. We see in his deposition that Murdoch is very testy. He gets very impatient and snappish. That's not a good look before the jury. And these guys, as we've seen with Trump over the years, they're not used to being challenged. They're not used to facing tough questions and grow quite impatient when confronted with them. So I think his potential testimony really could be one of the make or break moments in this trial.
So, Katie, I will stay away from the engagement, the plane, the houses, and the age. But I will say that what we know from what has been revealed through the multiple filings that we've seen is that Rupert Murdoch thought it was I want to quote him, it was, quote, pretty much a crime what Trump was doing by lying about the election result. Rupert Murdoch thought it was a, quote, pretty much a crime, and thought it was inevitable that everything would blow up on January 6th. How much does that foreknowledge, and using the term crime, talking about Trump's criminality, how much does that impugn anything else that gets said in this trial?
So the trial is focusing on a very strict window of time, Nicolle. It's not going to be forever and a day. It's really from the moment when the election occurred in November until January of 2021. But I will say the judge noted and told all parties today, January 6th will not be a part of this trial. It will not be raised. It will not become an issue in this trial because the judge says the defamation at issue that Dominion Voting says was perpetrated by Fox News and Fox Corporation predated that January 6th insurrection date. But to your point, Rupert Murdoch is about to eat a $1.6 billion plus pie of crow because at this point, he has blessed what happened on his network. But interestingly, Judge Davis set this up for Dominion, Nicolle, meaning when he denied Dominion's motion for summary judgment when it came to whether or not Fox Corporation published the defamatory statements, when he entered that damning ruling on Friday, he basically created a situation wherein Dominion Voting had to come to the court and say, Judge, we need these witnesses to appear. We need them to appear. They have to appear live. And the judge agreed with Dominion. And Nicolle, the very last page of the order from the judge dated March 31st says these are the three issues for the jury to consider. Publication as to Fox Corp, actual malice as to Fox News and Fox Corp, and whether Dominion incurred any damages. The falsity's already been determined. So right now, Dominion has doesn't have a perfect ride, but it definitely has an easier ride in front of this jury when they go to trial.
Tim, I want to show our viewers, and I want to put up for all of us, the actual moments on the air when what Katie's talking about, when the alleged defamation takes place. This is a series of clips and moments on Fox News broadcasts where the conduct allegedly transpires.
Sydney, we talked about the Dominion software. I know that there were voting irregularities. Tell me about that.
That's to put it mildly. The computer glitches could not and should not have happened at all. That is where the fraud took place, where they were flipping votes in the computer system or adding votes that did not exist.
We have tremendous evidence already of fraud in this election.
I've gone over everything I've been able to find out. Nobody liked Dominion voting systems. Nobody. The professor, the three Democrats, the state of Texas, they had problems in Georgia, the New York Times, the AP. Why we would use a system that everybody agreed sucked or had problems is beyond me.
But at the same time, as you put together your case, Sydney, I assume that you are getting to the bottom of exactly what Dominion is, who started Dominion, how it can be manipulated, if it is manipulated at all, and what evidence do you have to prove this?
Oh, yes. We are collecting evidence through a fire hose.
So, Tim, the problems for Fox News, as I understand it, from smart reporters like Jeremy and smart lawyers like Katie, isn't just the outrageous things that were published, that were on their airwaves. But behind every one of those clips is a pile of evidence that Dominion told them none of that was true. Talk about where we are just 2 weeks ahead of this trial.
Yeah, and that they knew none of it was true. I mean, in a weird way, the best thing Fox has going for them is that Maria Bartiromo, who's in those clips, is like so insane. That when you look at her emails and texts, she's the only one that seems to have drank the Kool-Aid fully and actually believes this stuff. And she's begging Steve Bannon to save her and talking about crying. And so I think that Maria is off the deep end. But all the other folks, Tucker, Laura, Sean, Lachlan, Rupert, Suzanne Scott, They all knew. They all said in all these emails that they knew, and it's unprecedented. I believe it was in the Times they quoted a constitutional lawyer who said that they'd never seen emails like this that revealed a journalist explicitly saying, I know this is untrue, but we have to say it because that's what our viewers want. And it is as cut and dry as possible, for everybody in the case who hasn't gone fully, flew over the cuckoo's nest like Maria. And so, that not only did they know that it was untrue, they actually tried to, get vengeance against the people on the staff, multiple people on the staff that tried to correct the record. They threatened to fire Jackie Heinrich, who's a reporter who tweeted the truth. There was another producer that they targeted internally behind the scenes. So I just, the evidence here is overwhelming, that all of the decision makers at Fox knew that this was a lie and yet put it forth anyway because they're scared of their own viewers, which is honestly a kind of a microcosm of the whole, conservative elite and Republican elite movement over the past 7-8 years.
It is. It's like a snapshot of the American right. Jeremy, I want to, because I have the three of you, I want to go over the witness list, and I want to ask all of you to tell me what it is that they each provide. Tim mentioned Maria Bartiromo. She'll be a witness. Fox is going to make her available. Tucker Carlson, Lou Dobbs, Sean Hannity, and Jeanine Pirro. And I'll stop there because Brett Baier and Dana Perino seem to be in a different category. Tell me what you think these witnesses speak to. Bartiromo, Carlson, Dobbs, Hannity, and Pirro.
I think Bartiromo, for lack of a better term, is going to be the star witness in Dominion's. She's kind of the centerpiece. It all starts with her November 8th broadcast when she hosts Sidney Powell and that clip you just played. What we now know, because of the evidence Dominion has been able to secure from Fox, is that Maria had ample reason to suspect that Sidney Powell was not credible because she was in receipt of an email from Sidney Powell's source, who, as I think your viewers well know by now, was the woman who talks to ghosts. And as a credible journalist, I think I find it hard to believe that any juror is going to look at that email, know that Maria Bartiromo had it in her possession, and say, yes, it was a good call. It wasn't reckless to put someone like Sidney Powell on the air. So she's really going to be at the forefront. I think the Lou Dobbs will be interesting, too, because he no longer works for the network. Fox fired him in early 2021. And so I would be very curious to see whether or not the bad blood that may exist between the two has any effect on his testimony. I can imagine he's probably quite disgruntled because he's been thrown under the bus. But I just don't know. So I would have my eye on the two of them. I think also Suzanne Scott. She is the key to this case because what you see in her emails with Rupert Murdoch is she was giving she has provided a rationale that this is purely a business decision. Their pursuit of guests who would espouse the big lie, and they're encouraging their hosts to tamp down on anyone who somehow suggests that the big lie may be just that, should not be on the air. Those people should not be on the air. That is all Suzanne Scott makes clear because they were terrified of what was happening to their ratings and they wanted to preserve their profits. And that is the kind of cynical thinking I think that is going to resonate with a jury when it comes to deciding a decision and ultimately damages if it comes to that.
Yeah, I mean, Katie, the evidence that's been amassed seems to have these things so synced up in terms of what we've been able to see so far. We see that they knew the information was false. We see from Dominion that I think it's 3,280 communications went from Dominion to Fox News. We see confirmation of receipt. So knowledge that they were told the information was false. And then we see the motive, as Jeremy's getting it. We see in emails like this from Tucker Carlson, Trump is a demonic force, a destroyer, but he's not going to destroy us. He's obsessed with the stock price and the ratings. We see from Suzanne Scott, the the CEO this message: this has to stop now, this being any coverage that includes the truth about the results of the election. Quote, I'm going to address this with you and Jay and Lowell tomorrow. This is bad business. There clearly is a lack of understanding what's happening in these shows. The audience is furious and we're feeding them material. It's bad for business. How does both the knowledge that they were broadcasting false information and the revelations that their motive was ratings and not losing any viewers, and this is in the emails as well, to farther right outlets, how does that present to a jury as a full and complete narrative?
Well, there's two critical concepts when it comes to that. This concept of actual malice, which Dominion still has to prove, can be done in one of two ways. They'd have to prove that Fox knew that what they were putting up was false, or Fox just recklessly disregarded the truth or the lack of truth and the falsity of what they were putting up there. Consider what you just read in the last, 15, 20 seconds. Dominion has hours of that testimony, hours of corroborating evidence that supports this idea. So when Judge Eric Davis on Friday granted summary judgment on behalf of Dominion to the issue of falsity, and you actually showed it on the show on Friday, you showed that the judge put in all caps and bold, it's crystal clear that anything that was said about Dominion on Fox News airwaves and the viewers that they took it in, anything that was consumed by the viewers about Dominion on Fox was false. Thank you. Now all you need is to put the bow on it, and the bow is going to be the damages for Dominion. So the jury's going to hear a story, but the story is going to be supported with the own words, the own messages, the texts, the emails, the chats, everything that was internal. And then one thing I would add, Nicolle, is that on this witness list from Fox, you're going to be hearing from people that were the executive vice president of primetime programming. You're going to hear from executive producers. You're going to hear from producers. So it wasn't just the hosts that were going rogue. They were not hosts that were going rogue. This went from the top all the way down. And that's why for Dominion to present a complete picture, they need Lachlan Murdoch all the way down to the Lou Dobbs in the world.
Yeah, I mean, the defamation was the corporate plan, Tim. I mean, it was their programming decision, as Katie Fang just said, from the top to the bottom.
Yeah, and let's start at the very top with Rupert Murdoch. I think that you could almost take everything out of this, except for the email you just read from Suzanne Scott talking about how it's bad business to tell the truth, and the email about from Rupert Murdoch when he's justifying why to put the My Pillow guy back on TV. I talk about reckless malice. The My Pillow guy had been spreading the most insane conspiracies about the election that even Tucker Carlson admitted privately he knew was insane, and others. And Rupert said, this isn't about red or blue, it's about green. I mean, they gave their motive as clear as day in emails. Like, this was about money, this was about audience share. And so I think that's why John Poulos, who's been, I give a lot of credit to, the CEO of Dominion, is out for blood on this. It was about money for them. And so I think that he's going to try to get his rightful compensation.
Tim, there's the legal part of this story, and we've tried to sort of ballast our coverage to the legal developments. But as someone who was once in the Republican Party, who has spent time on Fox News, I know most of viewers at this network think it has always been this evil. I think it's an incredibly devastating and sickening look at how cynical they were, how they treated their viewers. They don't revere them because they respect them. They fear them because they know they're addicted to the disinformation. And there is a sickness that is revealed through their internal communications with one another. They don't believe any of this, but they're going to peddle the BS to their view. It's like that doc on the fast food, right, where the guy eats McDonald's every day to see what happens to the body. The anchors aren't taking this information as fact. The anchors know it's absolute BS. They know Trump. They believe Trump is, quote, demonic, but they're going to revere him to their viewers. They're going to feed him the BS. And it is, for all of its legal power and importance and relevance, the window into sort of the rot in the most prominent, most watched cable network, not just on the right, but in the country, is unbelievable.
Yeah. I agree with all that, but just from my own experience, from perspective, look, there are always shows. I think that either shaded the truth or outright lied. You go back to the Glenn Beck conspiracy shows from the early 2010s. But I think that the network really did have this push and pull, right? Like they had real news folks. They continue to have, I think, a couple, 2 or 3 left over there that are out there doing reporting, in the field, and the opinion hosts. There was this push or pull, and back in 2015 and 16, they used to have me on as an anti-Trump Republican to argue with the pro-Trump hosts. And it wasn't just me. There were others, Jonah Goldberg and folks like that. Once Trump won, I think that they just really realized that they'd lost control of the audience, and they basically shut that down. And it went from a network that had a sickness, had some problems, didn't practice perfect journalism, of course, which is an understatement, between 2000 and 2016, to one that just became a full-on propaganda network because they had lost control, of their own audience. And I just think that the window into these private emails show what we all kind of knew to be true, to be true in spades.
All right, no one's going anywhere. Would we all come back? How the Dominion trial and Trump's indictment are just one part of what could be a pretty rotten month of legal developments for the ex-president and Trumpian Republicans in America. And later in the program, an alarming and frankly anti-democratic development out of the state of Tennessee, where the Republican majority in the state House is trying to expel 3 Democrats for participating in a protest calling for gun safety legislation. The White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
Hey, it's Chris Hayes. This week on my podcast, Why Is This Happening? I'll be talking with trans rights activist and lawyer Chase Strangio about the tidal wave of anti-trans legislation.
If you think about what happens if the Senate majority shifts and the presidency shifts, we're having a federal ban on this care, just like we're having a federal ban on abortion, most likely. And what does that mean nationally? We're not prepared for that eventuality. But once they're moving all these bills so quickly and creating this sense that this is somehow a legitimate paradigm shift to cut people off from this treatment, that then paves the way for a huge amount of other intrusions.
That's this week on Why Is This Happening? Search for Why Is This Happening wherever you're listening right now and subscribe.
So the upcoming Dominion Fox News lawsuit going to trial that we've been talking about is just one of the many remarkable legal battles that will be waged this month, most of them centered around Trump or Trumpism. Yesterday, of course, marked the historic arrest of an ex-president who was indicted on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records. Next week, Donald Trump will have to return to New York, where he will be deposed for the second time in New York AG Letitia James' $250 billion civil fraud suit against him and his kids. On April 25th, Trump will be in court once again as former magazine columnist E. Jean Carroll's civil suit, where the ex-president is accused of assaulting Carroll in the mid-1990s and then lying about it, will finally go to trial. We're back with Jeremy, Katie, and Tim. Katie Fang, we don't spend enough time, but I know you do, covering all of these sort of legal carts being pushed down the aisle on their own timeline. One that I have been remiss in following closely enough is E. Jean Carroll. Tell me the state of that and what comes next.
Just like you said, it's going to trial April 25th, and we say that there's 2 cases. We call them Carroll 1, Carroll 2. Carroll 1 is the original defamation lawsuit brought by E. Jean Carroll for when Donald Trump was doing that presser when he was still in the Oval Office, and he said, she's a liar. She's not my type, if you will recall. He said that distastefully. Well, the DOJ under Garland intervened and basically stepped into the shoes of where Trump was as a defendant. So that's up on appeal to determine whether or not Trump defaming a woman like he did was something that was covered through the course of his duties or his job as president of the United States. Humbly, I submit absolutely not, but maybe some smarter people will agree with me. Carroll 2 is the second defamation and sexual assault lawsuit that was brought by E. Jean Carroll last year. He, as in Donald Trump, not in the Oval Office, defames E. Jean Carroll again on Truth Social. As a result, he's looking at a defamation lawsuit. But then also there was a New York state law that came into effect last year that allows people like E. Jean Carroll to sue for sexual battery, because the statute of limitations normally would not be permitting that to occur. But because of that New York state law, she was able to do so. Both of those have been combined for purposes of discovery Donald Trump was deposed. If you will recall, Nicolle, during that deposition, Donald Trump was shown a picture of his ex-wife, Marla Maples, and he said, he was shown a picture of E. Jean Carroll, and he goes, "Why is my ex-wife Marla Maples here?" Huh? So that goes to trial April 25th. But all kidding aside, it's obviously a very important trial. It's E. Jean Carroll's day in court, but critically, 2 other victims of sexual assault and battery by Donald Trump, the federal judge Lewis Kaplan is allowing them to testify at E. Jean's trial. So what's left to be seen is what and how is Donald Trump going to respond to 3 different victims that he's going to have to defend against during this trial.
And I mean, Jeremy, it goes without saying that Fox's own complicated history around sexual assault issues inside Fox News. It was the subject of some incredible reporting in the New York Times, which was turned into a movie. It was the subject of a scripted movie called Bombshell that depicted some of the more prominent female anchors. How they cover these things is interesting, humbly, to me, but I don't have any expectation that it'll be forthright or honest.
Or how they don't cover them, Nicolle, right? Because that's the power. I think it's less in their incessant coverage of crime in New York City and how Alvin Bragg has failed to prosecute certain offenders. It's less, they're picking apart the weaknesses in his case. Which is basically how a lot of this is getting covered. A lot of the Trump indictment is getting covered on Fox at the moment. That's not nearly as powerful as viewers of the network not hearing at all about many of these charges, or many of these allegations. And they're certainly not hearing much at all about what's happening with Fox News and Dominion, because the network has issued a blackout in coverage. And I think that's part of a very careful and cynical business calculation that if their audience doesn't hear about it from Fox, they're not going to hear about it from other conservative media. And so therefore it doesn't really matter in their eyes if this goes to trial. It doesn't matter to their bottom line because their viewers will be in the dark about it. Now, I think that there's, that's an awfully risky gamble to make because, as you pointed out, and we've mentioned many times on this show, the contempt that Tucker Carlson and others inside the network show, not just for Trump, but the lack of respect they appear to have for the intelligence of their own viewership is something that gets around. And, I've seen the Trump movement evolve, and I've seen, his kind of Teflon nature surprised me so many times with how little consequence he's ever paid for what he's done, to not be naive about the fact that this Fox trial ultimately may have no impact on their bottom line or have no resonance with their viewers. But I do know that Donald Trump, running for president in 2024, he can turn on Fox News in a dime, as he has in the past. And what this lawsuit shows us is just how afraid Fox is of that happening again. And I think that has a possibility to be one of the most intriguing storylines of the next 2 years.
Well, the X factor that I don't think anybody, really takes out and turns around is that people will be running against Trump in a Republican primary, Tim. And Trump is in the gutter. And if Ron DeSantis plans to meet him there and actually take him on and not go the way of the 14 Republicans who Trump ousted with vicious attacks like the ones he's already launched against DeSantis, he's going to have to use the airwaves of Fox News to remind people of some of these developments. I mean, he's not going to beat Trump in a debate over tax rates. What do you think the airwaves of Fox will sort of countenance in terms of Republicans attacking Trump on any of those shows?
Yeah, I don't know. There was all these rumors going around about how Rupert was done with Trump, and the New York Post had some negative Trump headlines when he announced, and Fox didn't have him on for a while. But I noticed the same thing Jeremy noticed the last couple days. Friends at Republican Accountability Project are monitoring Fox and others and watching their clips and watching what of it I can stomach. They're running cover for him right now, big time. Asa Hutchinson was on Fox today getting interviewed, and the host was like battering him and kind of making fun of him for being a Liz Cheney Republican and for being low in the polls. Like the one guy that's actually doing what you'd think Fox would want, which is espouse conservative policies and not bring the whole party down into the Trumpian gutter. And so it does seem like Fox is teetering back in Trump's direction, hasn't learned anything from the last 8 years. But I guess I will say there's one area where I kind of zag a little bit from the conventional wisdom on this. Everybody's out there talking about this week about how Trump is being helped by these indictments and people are rallying around him. And I guess that is true in the short term if you look at the numbers. But just listening to that list in the intro, which wasn't even totally inclusive of all the investigations that are out there.
Right.
I mean, this guy's going to be in court every month for the rest of the year. And you're telling me that's really going to help him? Like, is everyone 100% sure that having court dates about sexual assault and fraud and insurrection, et cetera, is going to help him? I'm not so sure, and I would love to see one of the Republicans try to use it against him. I'm not holding my breath, but I'd love to see it.
I know we've learned better than to hold our breath that any of them would actually take him on. It will be interesting if it ever happens, though. Jeremy Peters, Katie Fang, and Tim Miller, thank you so much for being part of our coverage today. Coming up for us here, Tennessee Republicans are trying to expel 3 Democratic lawmakers for leading a protest demanding gun safety reform just days after a tragic mass shooting at a school in Nashville. We'll bring you that story next.
Hey everyone, it's Tremaine Lee, MSNBC correspondent and host of the podcast Into America. A train derailment and chemical spill in East Palestine, Ohio, caused panic and anger among residents and triggered a big response from the EPA. But for people who live in so-called sacrifice zones, especially in Black communities, environmental issues like this are a way of life.
So when you live in a sacrifice zone, you're basically being poisoned every day. So it becomes an intergenerational cycle of poison and poor public health.
Listen now and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
This is wrong. This is not a democracy. This is what a dictatorship and oligarchy, this is what that form of government, that's what we expect, but not here in the state of Tennessee, not in the United States of America.
Article 2, Section 27 of the state constitution says that lawmakers have a right to protest against and dissent from any legislation that is injurious to the people and have their protests marked in the Journal of the House. That's what we were doing.
They are going with the NRA and the Tennessee Firearms Association instead of listening to the people of Tennessee. They're allowing children to die while doing nothing.
Tennessee state legislators Justin Pearson, Justin Jones, and Gloria Johnson responding to the extraordinary move by Tennessee Republicans to expel them for protesting against their own state's inaction on gun violence. The 3 have already been stripped of all their committee assignments, and their ID badges, get this, have been deactivated. They no longer work to open the doors to their offices or the building. The resolutions to expel the members alleges that the 3 had participated in, quote, disorderly behavior. The Speaker of the House likened the protest to a, quote, insurrection. One of the members facing expulsion pointed out this, quote, we had a child molester on the floor for years. They helped him get reelected and did nothing to expel him. We've had members pee in each other's chairs. We've had members illegally prescribe drugs to their cousin mistress. And nothing happened. But talk on the floor without permission, and you will get expelled. That vote is set for tomorrow. Joining us right now, one of the 3 Tennessee House Democrats being targeted for expulsion by Republicans. State Representative Gloria Johnson, our friend Eddie Glaude, the chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, joins us as well. Representative Johnson, I want to go back in time, but let me start with right now. Tell me what the situation is that you face today and what you expect tomorrow.
Well, it's hard to know what to expect. This is unprecedented. And so, interestingly enough, I just got a visit from HR where they told me that if we are expelled, I will lose my health insurance. But if I were to resign, I would not lose my health insurance. So, this is what we plan to do, is show up, and we are happy to speak to this issue and talk about what happened. And we want a hearing in front of the people. We want folks to be able to see. We're not going to make any deals. We want to plead our case in front of the people, and that's what we plan to do. Because we spoke up for victims of gun violence. I am a teacher. I taught for 27 years. I taught at Central High School in Knoxville, Tennessee in 2008 when we had a shooting at our school. It was a breakfast in the cafeteria. I was down in my classroom that morning. My classroom was disconnected from the main part of the school. I look up and I see kids running down the hall, heading toward my classroom, screaming, crying. Had no idea what's happening. And when they finally get in the room, it was several minutes before they could even articulate what had happened and what they had seen. The trauma, the fear of those students, I will never, ever forget. And I will always make sure that I speak up for victims of gun violence and for gun sense legislation. And we were not given a voice on the House floor to speak up that day.
I am so sorry that you are yourself a victim of the trauma of the country's epidemic of gun violence, and as a firsthand witness of how this can and does impact our youngest and most precious, I'm just surprised that they haven't turned to you, especially in the wake of the tragic shooting last week. Can we go back to the shooting, and can you take me inside what has happened in the state where the protests, when they started, when your support of the protesters put you at odds with Republicans in the chamber?
Sure. Yeah. That morning I got there early because I knew that there were going to be protesters there. I wanted to speak to them. I wanted to know them to know that they were seen and that there were people in that room that cared about, what was happening and cared about the safety of their kids. I talked to so many mothers who were crying. They had just dropped their children off at school, and they were nervous about dropping their kids off at school, hoping that they would be safe when they returned to pick them up that afternoon. But they were saying that they had, every time you hear about this, you have a fear. But when it happens in your community, that fear is even greater. That, is my child going to be safe today? And we are the only nation in the world that has this type of gun violence. And there are things that we can do. They talk about they want to harden up our schools and put more security. We need to keep our schools safe. But if we're smart, we're going to prevent the guns from ever getting to the schoolhouse door. We don't want gun battles at the schoolhouse door. We want to make sure that those weapons do not get to the door of our children's schools.
Representative Justin Pearson has also joined our conversation. I want to bring you in 1 second. I just want to ask you one more question. Representative Johnson, what caused the break with Republicans? It would seem that a tragedy in which 3 9-year-old children in your state are murdered in a mass shooting at an elementary school might, I don't know, maybe I'm, too delusional for the times in which we live, might create or generate a moment of unity. Was it because the parents that were scared and protesting and demanding gun safety legislation were not welcomed by or what caused the rupture that led to this unbelievably fast escalation where tomorrow you and 2 of your other colleagues may be expelled from the body? How does that happen?
Well, because we have a body that has taken away our voice. They have lessened the ability to debate on the floor. And we usually have something called welcoming and honoring in the morning. And we wanted to welcome and honor those folks, those victims coming in. Because as the Democrats walked through the protesters, we talked to them, we listened to them. But as my colleagues across the aisle walked by, they didn't even make eye contact with those moms and toddlers and teenagers. And so our inability to be allowed to recognize them, to lift their voices on the House floor was incredibly frustrating. And Justin Pearson, he can talk a little bit more to how he was shut down in addition. But then we had bills where they didn't call on our members, quickly called the question, and we weren't allowed to have that discussion, debate, or even mention those protesters. And we decided we need to make sure that between bills, we walk to that podium and let them know we saw them, we heard them, we are with them on their issue, and we want to bring gun sense legislation.
Representative Johnson, you said HR told you today that if you resign, you keep your health care. If you are expelled, you lose it. Do you have any plans to resign?
I have no plans to resign. If they want to bring that resolution to the floor, I am ready to fight in full view of the state of Tennessee and all of my constituents.
Representative Pearson, thank you so much for joining us today. I want you to take me through how this escalated so quickly, in your view, that you and two of your other colleagues face expulsion from the chamber for standing with your constituents, for standing with the majority of Americans who would like to see something done on the topic of gun safety legislation.
You know, thousands of people came to the Capitol, mostly children and teenagers, who were asking for the representatives in the State House to do something. They came to the Capitol for us to do something, to pass gun sense legislation, to stop the epidemic of gun violence that took the lives of 6 people in Nashville and my community of Memphis and Shelby County, a beautiful place. We are still dealing with an increase of murders by 44%. We're still dealing with people breaking into cars to steal guns because we passed a permitless carry law here in the state of Tennessee. Because we went to the House floor to speak up and to hear the voices of our constituents and community who said, we need justice and we need action. The Republican Party has said you need to be expelled, not because we committed a crime, unlike the last 2 folks who got expelled, who committed 22 offenses of sexual assault, and the other who committed bribery. People who committed criminal acts were expelled from the House. But because we broke House decorum, we went to the House floor using our First Amendment rights so that we can listen to the First Amendment rights of children and teenagers and mothers who are grieving. We're told that we're being expelled, and it's the language. It is the language of people in positions of power in the Republican Party, like Speaker Sexton, that is leading to this escalation. He called children who held signs saying, "Am I next?" Who held signs saying, "I'm 9 years old," just like 3 of the victims at the Covenant School in Nashville. He called them insurrectionists. He called grieving mothers insurrectionists. And that type of language, that is what continues to fuel a really unfair and unjust fire that doesn't focus on the issue of ending gun violence, but promotes division, and it promotes extreme measures and appalling measures like the expulsion of democratically elected members who represent over 200,000 people in this state.
Eddie, 2 weeks before the mass shooting that took the lives of 3 9-year-olds as well as 3 adults, 6 people were murdered that day. A poll in Tennessee revealed that 70% of the citizens of Tennessee would like to see background checks on all gun sales in the state. 63% would like red flag laws there to temporarily remove guns. About 54% would like to see the age increased to 21. And a minority of just 35% would like to see all teachers carrying guns for the kinds of shootouts that Representative Johnson warned about. We have this conversation a lot of days about Republicans leaning into authoritarian and anti-democratic tactics. I don't think you see it this starkly, where 3 representatives who are standing up for the 70, 63, and 53% of their constituents face expulsion for doing so. What do you think the stakes are tomorrow in Tennessee, Eddie, for the country?
Well, I think, it's a part that stands in for the whole. And there are components here. First, we hear a description from Representative Johnson of a process the distorted nature of the deliberative process within the House of Representatives, that the minority party can't engage in actual debate around issues and policies and bills that affect their constituencies. That's shut down. So it opens up space where they have to engage in any kind of insurgent activity, kind of disruptive activity in order to have their voices heard. And then you have, on the basis of breaking rules of decorum, you're going to disenfranchise people in District 90, people in District 52, District 86, 200,000 plus folks. You're going to disenfranchise them because you really don't care about democracy. But it says to me that what they're doing in this moment is turning a blind eye to the reality that those 9-year-olds were murdered because of their policies, were slaughtered because of their policies. And it seems to me, Nicolle, that it represents the kind of devolution of our democratic process, but it also necessitates that we act in this bold kind of way. We cannot cower in the face of it all. We have to fight it as aggressively as we can. So I applaud the representatives for doing what they're doing, and to continue to fight.
Representative Pearson, do the Republicans have a policy proposal that you can debate with them to advance the beliefs of 70% of the voters in the state that background check legislation or red flag laws are needed?
The Republicans have not proposed any such legislation. The legislation that we have seen this session in particular is all about how we protect the Second Amendment more. Even today, there was a proposal to make sure that we can arm teachers. The conversations now about schools isn't about how we can prevent guns from getting to them or prevent people who shouldn't have them having them. The conversation is, how do we make sure that the schools all have security resource officers? How do we make sure, even as one person in leadership of the Republican Party said, I'll put a tank in front of every school. But the reality is about the gun violence epidemic in our country that we have to realize that a lot of communities, particularly Black communities and poor communities, are suffering from is not only in schools, it's in your neighborhood. It is something that we are experiencing every single day. I have my own classmate this year who was killed by gun violence. We have mothers grieving and grandparents and brothers and sisters and siblings who are having to bury their loved ones because of legislation that is not valuing people's lives.
We will not take our eye off the goings-ons in your state. I welcome both of you back tomorrow to take me through the Republicans' continued escalation. Tennessee State Representatives Gloria Johnson and Justin Pearson, thank you so much for joining our coverage. And Eddie Glaude, thank you so much for being here today, my friend. Another break for us. We will be right back.
When Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich was detained in Russia in March and charged with espionage, he was simply doing his job.
Evan Gershkovich is not a spy. He is a talented, resourceful, dedicated professional journalist.
He doesn't belong in jail. That's not where he belongs. He belongs in this newsroom.
He's being held hostage, essentially. And through no fault of his own, he's behind bars.
Those were colleagues of detained Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich pleading for his release. Evan Gershkovich has been in Russian custody since last Thursday. He is accused by Russia of spying on behalf of the U.S. government. We learned that Evan met with his lawyers for the first time, according to the Wall Street Journal. His lawyers say that he is reportedly in good health, and he's grateful for the support from around the world as the U.S. and others continue to work toward his release. It's a story we'll stay on top of around here. Another break for us. We'll be right back. Thank you so much for letting us into your homes during these truly extraordinary times. We're grateful.
The battle over a woman's right to choose, global economic challenges, the ongoing threat to democracy. When you sign up for the MSNBC Daily Newsletter, you're signing up to have a deeper understanding of today's biggest issues. Every morning, you'll get insightful articles sent directly to your inbox, written by people you know and trust, like Hayes Brown and Mehdi Hassan, along with video highlights from your favorite MSNBC shows. Sign up for MSNBC Daily at msnbc.com.